let's have a quick look at Ukraine. The time available, we're going to take a sort of grand strategic look at it. It's been on for years now. Zelensky's kept it top of the news agenda very successfully for some time, but it is falling gradually off the agenda. Russia's on the front foot across a whole mass of the front line, incrementally moving and taking huge casualties, but they are on the front foot. Western support, slugs of aid, but inconsistent, feast and famine without any real long-term aim. Potential change of US leadership coming up at the end of the year, which might have profound implications. It feels like things are looking pretty bleak for Ukraine. I'm just wondering what's your take on it?
Yeah, and in addition to all the stuff you've just mentioned, I think there's a question whether they actually want back the ground they've got, the Russia have got, after what they've done to it. You know, they've ethnically cleansed it, they've imported their own people. And so if this goes back to Ukraine, effectively they've now got a Russian enclave within their own country. So even if they have total catastrophic success, where they sweep Russia from every sort of yard of Ukraine, they're still going to be left with an absolute car crash that perhaps they don't even want at this point. Have Russia done enough to it to make it un-Ukrainian? And that's dreadful. And of course, I don't support any of that stuff. This is just realpolitik. It's a harsh reality that Ukraine might have to face up to. Much as I wish they didn't have to do that.
But what does good look like then? Because I don't disagree with that. But the danger is then, so what does good look like? Because there isn't a concept of winning or losing anymore. I don't think those terms they resonate. But again, how do you bring this to an end? Because if Russia comes to an end and they have taken territory as a result of military action, that leaves a lot of questions in the international community about effectively rewarding aggression and what message that might send to other nations who might have similar designs in different parts of the world. But ultimately, Ukraine is the minnow compared to the Russian giant. So how?
I mean, I think we're moving past the international rules-based order phase of the world's existence now. I think international law is so degraded and so broken across the board. I'm not convinced it's remotely useful, other than as a fig leaf for people to flex with. Might does make right in many instances in history. The bigger, stronger side takes land and takes victory from the smaller. And this is, we're going back thousands of years here. And I suspect that what we've had, thanks to the Cold War, is a blip in human history where we had a peaceful period. Because the threat of nuclear war was too much to overcome. Now we're well below that threshold. I suspect we're reverting to an era of many more small conflicts around the world, and international humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict being impossible to stop it.
But so things like the United Nations, it feels like it's almost outlived its usefulness. UN Security Council, its president was Russia, and yet when you look at the main reason that it exists is to ensure peace and prosperity. The International Court of Justice, the ICC, there are certain people who don't subscribe to that, and therefore if they work because most people subscribe to them, but it feels like the main tectonic plates here don't subscribe to those anymore. So the very fabric of what ties international relationships seems to be crumbling, and that feels like a dangerous
place to be, isn't it? Yeah, and I think this stage of the recording is in danger of us just agreeing with each other for 10 minutes. But I think if we look at kind of how post-war the UN Security Council has been used, we gave it a body blow in 2003 with the Iraq War. I cannot see any legality for that at any point. Particularly in the lack of weapons of mass destruction, etc., etc. But actually, if you look at the mechanics of how the UN is supposed to work and how you are supposed to go to war legally, we chinned all that off, us and the Americans and all our other allies. So we dealt it a body blow. And I think in the aftermath of that, our enemies, our strategic competitors, I should say, have looked at that and gone, okay, cool. So we can do that too then as well. Happy with that. And as a result, they're effectively weaponizing it against us, because we're still adamant, international rules-based order, IHL, LOAC, very important stuff. And we're giving our kind of ivory tower position to the rest of the world, whilst our competitors royally chin it off. And on the occasions that we transgress, they'll then take us to various courts to be punished for it, even though they have no intention of maintaining it themselves. And South Africa is a great example with the ICJ case. They are in bed with people who are committing a genocide in Sudan now, and yet they're bringing a genocide case to the ICJ. It's a perfect example of this hypocrisy I'm talking about. And of course, South Africa are in bed with the Russians and the Iranians, and they're firmly on that side of things. And so we're at the point now where international law is just something that is a stick to beat us with, whilst everyone else in the world gives it a round ignoring.
Does that mean that, because we've sort of saw this under the previous Trump presidency with a US first, and actually I would argue that every nation operates in its own national interest first. Yes, you can look benevolent, we try and do, but ultimately it's about our own. And the danger is it feels like, rather than investment in these organisations, these international organisations, that gradually people are pulling out just to become isolated stovepipe nations. And the trouble is, history suggests that that's a really bad place to be. I mean, part of the value of the United Nations was nobody agreed in there, but at least it created an opportunity for people to talk and to identify with gentlemanly conversations. I know that might sound antiquated, but as soon as you start withdrawing from that and it becomes just a polarised world, NATO has been a successful alliance, maybe, but has that precipitated some of the frictions that we've seen? Is that the catalyst for an axis of evil now? China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, maybe others, that would that have generated were it not for the expansion of NATO? And therefore, are we almost masters of our own destiny here?
Or masters of our own downfall? I mean, it's not unreasonable if you zoom out again to say, look, if this bunch of countries are all going to group together, well, why can't we? Just because they're ideologically opposed. I mean, if I was looking at trying to defeat the world's strongest military superpower in the history of the planet, the US, and let's be honest, that's basically what NATO is, no matter how much we talk about a collective of nations. NATO's doing nothing without the USA, and you know that as well as I do. If I'm trying to compete with them, I can't do it on my own, then yeah, I'm definitely going to draw people in. So China doesn't have huge force projection for its military. China is strategically competing for resources and share of GDP with the USA. And so what they've done is they've drawn in the countries that do have a bit of military projection, and they're using them to damage NATO, to damage the UN, and undermine that structure that is essentially propping up American hegemony in the planet. So it's a very clever strategy.
But it'd be follow that through, and therefore it probably paints quite a bleak picture for Ukraine, because Ukraine isn't a member of NATO. Let's remind ourselves.
Yeah.
We got more involved for all sorts of reasons. Potentially one of them is on European doorstep, and we've got a memory of what some of these things can have an impact. But it does feel like we're getting close to the stage where, I'm not suggesting literally, but metaphorically, we walk away from Ukraine, that it becomes come to an agreement. You're not going to like it, Zelensky, you're probably going to have to move on. But actually, the world's appetite for fighting a war on your terrain is waning, and actually, Russia has been badly damaged by this, and I just worry that it feels like that's where we're heading with this at the moment.
Yeah.
And the losses, we talked about relocation of people in Israel, tens of thousands. We're talking about millions of relocation, communities completely devastated, hundreds of thousands of lives lost. For what? Yeah,
well, I think the first duty of any government is to secure their borders, and so I can completely understand Ukraine's motivation to fight. That's the foundation of their existence as a country, and to try and secure their own borders. So I get why they resisted Russia so aggressively, rather than going, cool, okay, we'll be a territory of you again. That's totally a sentiment that I think we can all agree on. If it was the UK, we'd do the same. The issue comes, of course, where they're entirely reliant on the West for that fighting effort, and that's where they've come a cropper, because if you're entirely reliant on somebody else, you're therefore reliant on that person's politics and that person's government and that person's strategy and policy. And if that doesn't align with you winning the war that you're fighting, then you're in real trouble. And I think that's the point we're at with Ukraine now.
As a former soldier, I'm interested though, do you think there is a way that Ukraine could be fighting smarter? I'm thinking of things like a centre of gravity like Crimea, and that actually getting dragged into an attritional war is clearly not the answer for Ukraine.
Yeah.
And therefore, do you think as a soldier, there are smarter ways that Ukraine could have fought this?
Yeah, I mean, I think last summer's counter-offensive was a disaster. You know, they resisted Western calls for one hard, swift punch. They went for a kind of a break the glass, slow pressure on the Russian line that didn't work. And now they're paying the price because they've shot their best bolt, which is part of the reason why they are where they are today. They made a real operational blunder in how they designed that operation. And yeah, it's, unless we bring in Western air power, I don't see a way to get around this.
Do you think there's an appetite for ever doing that?
No, I don't. But I think air power is the only thing that will separate this conflict to a decisive conclusion. We're not giving them aircraft. We're not giving them the air defences that they need to completely annihilate the Russian Air Force. And so stalemate is very much where I think this is going now as a result.
$15 trillion worth of assets under the ground. Lot to protect. Either protect it from Russia and China and so on, or just keep it for ourselves and trade it, because there's going to be a lot of trading going on with Ukraine once it's all over. So I don't know, how suspicious should we be of Western motives?
No, I mean, I don't give much credence to that, if I'm honest. I think the idea that we're keeping the war in Ukraine going to suit our own economic benefits, that doesn't feel right to me. And I think if we strip it back to the original origin of the conflict, Russia have invaded Ukraine, and they are a stated ally of ours. We've drawn them towards the EU, we've drawn them towards NATO, and we have a strategic competitor in Russia. So morally, backing Ukraine, I think, was the right decision by the international community. Why would the US burn all that money, all that time, all those Ukrainian lives, for a war that pretty much looks like it's going to be a stalemate anyway? You know, are we really that suspicious of the Biden White House that we think they're artificially prolonging a conflict to make profit for American companies? That's the question it boils down to. And the issue is we can't get an answer here. We don't know.
No.
It might be true. It's a possibility.
There are a lot of people saying it.
Yeah, but where's the evidence? You know, let's use Occam's razor. What's more likely, given that we have no evidence in either position, which is the more likely one? Discuss. And again, that's going to depend on worldview, isn't it?
Okay, so on NATO. So the Labour government has stated through the King's speech they're going to do everything in their power to get Ukraine into NATO. So, what do you think?
Well, a bit late for that, isn't it? I mean, if that's part of a ceasefire arrangement, potentially I can see that being a chip on the table, either for one way or the other. You know, it could be a guarantor of a ceasefire deal, because how else do you trust Russia to keep to it? Because they've had ceasefire deals before.
But if Russia wants to do a ceasefire, it seems like highly unlikely that they would tolerate Ukraine being in NATO as part of that deal.
The flip side is that's still a bargaining chip.
It's a bargaining chip, but the more you try and take it off the table.
Yeah, sure.
You know, you can actually say, okay, fine, we won't have them in NATO then. And then you've given a concession, haven't you?
Yeah, but I think part of this is the pace at which, you know, trying to make it happen to lock it in, rather than actually going, okay, if it's a bargaining chip, I buy it.
Yeah.
But if you try and lock it in, you might be prolonging a conflict, because actually Putin goes, no, I'm not going to have NATO on my doorstep here. I know it's on my doorstep in other places, but I'm not going to have it here.
Yeah.
The irony, of course, is if he took the whole of Ukraine, it will be on his doorstep. So it's slightly weird.
Well, how weak? So we said earlier that, you know, Russia's been weakened by this. No, you know, internationally, politically, it's not gone well. His wife, you know, won't be shopping in Paris much for the next few years. But actually, has it weakened Russia economically, leaving aside its reputation? Okay, so we're not buying oil from Russia anymore, but the oil we're not buying, it's now selling to India.
Yeah.
And we're buying it from India, by the way. From a fossil fuel point of view, it's a nightmare for us. So, trade, I haven't done the actual numbers, but, trade may have just switched. You've got the BRICS thing, which you talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. That's growing, the appetite to build another network. Turkey, NATO, 1952, one of the largest military forces in the EU, in Europe, not the EU. That's probably not going to happen. Now siding with the BRICS side. All of that change. Has Russia actually ultimately suffered, or will it come out, as strong or stronger?
I mean, they've lost a lot of people. They've lost a lot of ammunitions. They've shown their armed forces as being particularly poor. They were doing quite a good job of maintaining that they were pretty good before this war, and they've now been shown to be an absolute paper tiger. Economically, it is costing them a fortune, and they're robbing Peter to pay Paul at the moment. So that is going to come. That is going to come home to roost economically at some point. But Putin still looks pretty solid. There's almost certainly going to be no punishment for anyone who started all this stuff. They're going to get away scot-free from a legal perspective. ICC, best of luck with that. I'd be very surprised if we see Vladimir Putin in The Hague. So there are huge positives to take away for Russia from their perspective. They've also really solidified some of their links with the Iranians. They've had a good result in the Middle East as far as destabilizing the US influence has gone. So that there are huge positive plus points here, and there aren't many for Ukraine, if we're brutally honest. So I think strategically you probably can call it a victory, but I don't like that term, or a win. Sure. But they've made gains. Yeah. They've made positives. They are going to pay for it economically slightly further down the line, which is why sanctions become really important to make sure that they do get hurt off the back of this.
But what do you think Trump will do? If on the assumption that Trump makes it in, there's a deal to be done. What's
Donald Trump going to do? I have no idea. I mean, the guy is so unpredictable. All the noises they're making seem very pro-Russian from where I'm sat. We can't take away from the fact this is China, USA. We always have to come back to that, I think, when we're looking at this stuff. I just hope Trump's got an advisor in there somewhere who can say, hey, if you empower Russia, you're empowering China. Let's think very carefully about how we take this forward. But Trump's campaign is so light on detail, so light on actual practical outcomes.
Well, and part of their subtext goes all the way back to the start of our conversation. Misinformation, disinformation. Listening, it's US politics. It's nothing to do with us. But actually, when he did the televised debate with Biden, I wish there could have been a beeper for every time there was a mistruth spoken.
I think it was more than one a minute, wasn't it, over the duration?
It was, and you sort of went, how do people get away with that? They're just saying things that sound good, but actually don't have... And the danger is some of these... Trump's talked about NATO, people paying their way. I get it. I think there's that's not been a negative thing, and I'd probably be the same. Going, come on, you guys, you should be spending your way. But some of the rhetoric around Ukraine has profound implications for world security, European security, and the messages that are sent to Xi Jinping around Taiwan or the global challenge around resources that's going to happen.
I think all the other countries who might be listening to the words, they understand the subtext as well. So they understand the games because they play the games themselves. So I don't think, my personal opinion, occasionally I put one forth, is that I think it has less of an impact because these other people, they know what's going on. And all politicians are liars. So... And it's like taken for granted. We're getting it in spades now with our new government. Said one thing 3 weeks ago and saying something completely different now. So you sort of come to understand it, and no better people to understand it than your political, enemies internationally. So I think, I don't like it, but I think everybody who's in the game understands the way the game.
It just feels like the reason for the question is, Trump. We talked about social media, we talked about messaging, we talked about people just hearing something they like the sound of. Trump's campaign, Trump has always been that person who resonates with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that feels like that's a worry for all the reasons we talked about before. And I just wonder your take on, in terms of security, in terms of Israel, in terms of Ukraine, in terms of Taiwan, in terms of, this has it has implications. America is the world superpower.
Yeah,
people listen to the president.
US isolationism never goes well.
No,
we've seen it before in history, and it took us into another world war. And the real issue I have with analysing Trump is that I don't know. He doesn't tell us what he's actually going to do. I'm going to give you all energy. I'm going to make us the greatest country in the world again. It's all just sound bites. Like, what is he actually going to do when he's in power? And that's so important. And he's given us almost no information. What we can do is look back at what he did before. It's... if we look at what he did before, Middle East, he was actually relatively solid. His support for Israel was there. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem. The region was a fair bit more stable than it is currently. And there wasn't a war in Eastern Europe. This happened on Biden's watch. So we don't have to despair, I think, at a Trump presidency. I'm not keen on it. It's not who I'd vote for. And morally, I think he's utterly bankrupt and unsuited to the position. But he's the candidate they've got, and that's that. And you have to kind of try and work out what he stands for. But I don't know, I think is
so what we can do something about is our own defence. So one of the things I'm really keen just to get your take on, feels like the Cold War, dangerous times, 5 or 6% GDP on defence, missile systems around, attack of our mini vowels, op vowels, then peace dividend, 30 years where we've been focused on saving money, wars of choice. Feels like a more dangerous world at the moment, and yet the answer seems to be 2.5%. Defence review that might take a year, probably 2 years before it's implemented. Mm-hmm. Where do you think defence needs to go as a nation? And particularly with your background, the British Army seems to feel like it's lost its way a bit at the moment, a sense of its role as a central pillar of the defence of our nation. How does that get resolved?
If we look at the history of this, the army was the weapon fired by the Royal Navy. That was the paradigm for so many years. What we've got at the moment is essentially a glorified training organisation with a bit of armour. That's basically the British Army now. They need to focus on undoing everything that Nick Carter did while he was Chief of the General Staff. I think it's hard to overstate how dreadful and how much damage that man did to the British Army. Our infantry is shredded. We've got infantry battalions now permanently re-rolled as experimental battalions. We've got Rangers, which is another way of cutting hundreds of troops out of existing infantry battalions, giving them a silly new cap badge and then sending them off around the world to do training tasks. We've also got Security Force Assistance Brigades who do exactly the same thing but aren't called special. And then when we look at our core business, which is the Armoured Division, by design that's only 2.5 brigades. It's 2 fighting brigades and a deep strike reconnaissance brigade. It's not a division as you would recognise it in the traditional sense. The army is a smouldering wreck at the moment. I cannot tell you how terrible the situation is. And on top of that, they're losing 7 people for every 5 they recruit. Nick Carter has destroyed the British Army, and their focus needs to be on putting together 2 armoured divisions that can be deployed in a decent amount of time to face threats that our collective security arrangement suggests we need to face.
Do you think the answer, though, is around a divisional model, lots of people? I'm at the risk of being a bit provocative. We are an island nation. A lot of our threats are a distance away. Probably our future defence lies in alliances rather than purely a national basis. And therefore, it's what role we want to play in those alliances. Is that, at one end of the spectrum, putting a significant body of people on the ground? Our appetite after Afghanistan was that we were a bit less comfortable with that. Or is it another way of providing our role in that alliance, in that team? I'm wondering...
Yeah, I get that. You cut the cloth you have. If we decide that when it comes to a NATO deployment, we just want to be a bit player that provides some very niche capabilities while somebody else does the fighting, then okay, that's a decision for politicians, frankly. I think it's a terrible decision. I think the UK should be a leader in our national defence alliances. I think that's an important part of global strategy and you know who we are as a country. Not to mention the economic benefits that actually come from creating an arms industry again. You know, there's jobs and there's money to be made here.
How big do you think an army? I mean, I'm not trying to get a solution, but you know, what sort of number do you feel is a sort of number which the British Army would be?
I mean, I don't think numbers is useful. I think capability is useful, and I think I would stick at 2 divisions, because anything less than, it's very similar to aircraft carriers. You can't just have one. You need a second one in case the first one breaks.
Yeah.
And that will be expensive. There's no two ways about it. And if there's no money, then frankly, I'm just writing my defence, Christmas letter to Santa here. We do have to be real about the amount of money that's here. But I would certainly focus on getting at least one armoured division.
Yeah, but if it's true that the number one priority of a nation's politicians is the defence of the realm, if we are in a more dangerous world, if that dangerous world actually needs 5 or 6% of GDP to create the layered defences that our nation needs, it feels to me that we ought to wake up and have that conversation.
Yeah, I agree, but there's no votes in defence, and there never have been. And the only time this will have public support is when we're actually in a war and we've had a Dunkirk. I think that's what it's going to take. It's going to take getting our backsides handed to us before we wake up about defence. So I think Dunkirk 2 is going to be the moment that the national conversation changes. Until then, the priority is hospitals and prisons at the moment, I think, is a big issue.
But don't you think that with this world of technology, I love the analogies to history where you Dunkirk, but we then hide behind this little bit of ocean, which we call the North Sea, and then we rebuild for a couple of years and then we come at it again. The world of technology, these things might happen in minutes or hours rather than years. Yeah. So you don't have the time.
No, I agree. I'm just being pessimistic in my predictions.
Okay.
What I think should happen is we should throw money at the problem. Once we've worked out what it wants to look like, we need to, have radical surgery on all the ridiculous assistance stuff where we spread the army thinly around the world in the hope of strengthening our resilience or some such nonsense that Carter was coming out with. Pull those regiments back, turn them back into fighting units again, take away, weird special forces fetishism, and focus on building 2 armoured divisions that have the right amount of artillery and the right amount of logistic support, and all the stuff that comes with a division. That's what I would do if I was writing it with a blank slate and a blank check. That's what I'd do.
And how much do you think the war in Ukraine should influence because the dangers we fight the last war, and there's lots of things that flow from Ukraine: drone warfare, asymmetric role of technology, stockpiles. What lessons do you think that the British Army should be taking from that, if any?
I think we need to go back to the concept from when I first joined the army, where you prepare for a war, not the war.
Was that the First World War, was it?
Says you with your grey mop of hair.
Hair envy again, you see? We got the hair envy.
More tan envy, mate. It's very Des O'Connor.
Anyway, back to the...
You're so editing that bit out, aren't you?
I don't think we are. I don't think we are.
But yeah, going back to... I joined in 2005 and we were still talking about being ready to fight whatever comes around the corner. The lessons from Ukraine, I think, are interesting because everyone's focusing on the drone threat. In Gaza, the Israelis have locked down the drones. Like Hamas drones are shut down by technology that they wouldn't tell me what it was. And I've said for a long time, I think drones are just a new way of doing something old. It's about finding the enemy. It's about fixing the enemy. It's about striking the enemy. It's kind of also democratized air power to an extent. You don't need fancy fighter jets anymore. You can achieve that with a very, very cheap equivalent. However, as with every technological development in the history of warfare ever, there will come a point where the counter technology exceeds the technology itself. And we need to be very careful about looking at shiny things and going, ooh, that's what we need, loads of drones, because then we'll get smacked when our enemies have really good counter drone. I think when it's so difficult to strategically forecast. If you look at the British Army, they charmingly push out, or I should say defence actually. Let's all take a purple hit on this one. What the world will look like in 2030. That was in 2016. If you read that now, it's hilarious. It looks nothing like how the world is, and so forecasting is so challenging. that essentially you just have to say, right, okay, we need a degree of mass. We know we're going to need artillery. We know we're going to need stuff to call in the artillery. We know we're going to need something to bring the shells forward for the artillery. Let's focus on getting that working. And in the meantime, let's find a tank that works and a reconnaissance tank that works and an armoured infantry vehicle that works and get them working. And then, at least we're moving in the right direction. So when the threat comes, hopefully we can adapt quickly enough to respond to it.
But I think that, I guess where I'm probing a little bit is you talk about fighter jets. We've had a rush to a more exquisite because we've gone. If there was a choice, we need to protect your army guys. We can't lose people on the battlefield, so we need to make sure that we spend a lot of money having exquisite capability, and we can't afford much of it. Now you go down, quantity may have a quality all of its own, but there may actually be a quality around mass, which may not be quite the Starship Enterprise, but it might be that we've got enough of them that some will get through, and therefore that's part of our modus operandi. That's why I wondered whether or not...
And the technology piece is really interesting. The Israelis were fascinating. Again, I'll go back to Gaza. Looking at the Merkava, the tank, that's modular. So when something gets damaged, they just pop off the broken bit, pop the one back on. They've had, I think one of their divisions has had, nearly 4,000 vehicles damaged in the war. Every single one of them has returned to the front line since being damaged, except 4. Hamas have killed a total of 4 armoured vehicles out of that division, and they're the ones who did Gaza City and Rafah. So it's not as if they haven't been in the fight. But that modular design of the tank, I think is really, a really good lesson in how to keep an army that's not that big, if we're honest, in the fight for an extended period of time. That's my concern about things like the F-35 is if that breaks, all of a sudden it's 6 weeks out of the game. If you're
the rest.
If you're in a fighting, fighting situation, you can't afford that.
But it's not just about the kids; it's also about the people. I mean, you talk a lot about PTSD and stuff that's happened in Afghanistan. The people in the IDF fighting in Gaza, undoubtedly, they will have seen some dreadful things. They will have had some life-changing experiences. What's the impact going to be for them in Ukraine? I don't suppose they have the time to worry about PTSD at the moment, but there's going to be a long-term impact for this. I do wonder whether we get ourselves tied up in knots eventually, that we look at if we are going to prepare for a significant scale conflict, how on earth do we deal with all of these various aspects of it?
How does defence medical services stop something happening like happened after Iraq and Afghanistan in the early days, where they had to rely on the charity sector to provide swimming pools for soldiers? That's where Help for Heroes came from, and the fact that Help for Heroes needed to exist in the first place is a real disgrace.
But at the end of the First World War, Second World War, I've spent a lot of time with veterans, and most of them, they never had any help with this stuff. And the huge privilege when you end up chatting to some of these veterans, within a minute of chatting to them, nearly all of them were in tears.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden they were talking with someone with the wings on their chest and they would open up, and it would open up some box at the back of their mind that they'd kept locked away, and this flood of emotion came out, and you went, have we betrayed these people because they've stored this stuff up?
I mean, to be fair, they probably didn't know what they had in the back of their head. I don't think the conversation around PTSD was particularly mature at that time, and we're lucky to live in an era where we know what these symptoms are and we can put a name on it. And actually you can now scan the brain and you can see the neurological changes that PTSD makes to your inside of your brain. I've had it done. And just by looking at the bits of my brain that were misfiring, the psychologist was able to tell me what my symptoms were without me even telling her. It's astonishing. And they're also able to target that and calm it down, but it's expensive and it's very hard to do, and there's not many people qualified to do it. But I digress slightly, but the point is that we now understand it so much better, where we didn't in 1945, and we certainly didn't in 1918. So you can say we've betrayed them, but actually you can't be held responsible for not knowing what you don't know.
And with so much going on, this is a bit of a burn question, really. Where does Andrew Fox fit in all this in the next few years? What do you see as your... It feels like defence is becoming a much bigger issue, spending, the world of information, lots of things that you are at the hub of. Where do you see your role over the next months, years?
I think I'm just going to keep trying to be honest to the world as I see it. I think that's probably what I try to do. I don't mind the amount of abuse I get on social media. But the one thing that does irritate me is like, you're doing propaganda. It's like, if anyone who actually knows me knows that would never be the case, because I just call it as I see it. And actually, as I've seen it in Israel, Gaza, I genuinely think the IDF are doing an all right job. And I know for a fact it's not a genocide, because I've done the research and, you know, I've got the facts and figures to prove it. But obviously, I'm just one lone voice in a storm of disinformation, and you know, two sides screaming at each other. And so, if calling me a propagandist is all they have, then that's not the greatest rebuttal. It's an uncomfortable
place to be. I mean, it's been my first exposure to some of this with the media stuff, and in a way, you try and keep yourself away from the Gaza thing, because unlike everywhere else where there's good guys, bad guys, you know, you can't be on the fence. You're either with us or you're against us. And so some of this vitriol that flies around, and you know, you put yourself in the centre of some of that.
Yeah, it brushes off me these days. Okay. I've been had C bombs dropped at me so many times I don't even notice anymore. But you know, I think I'm just going to keep trying to do what I do, which is look at the facts of stuff that I've got a relatively good knowledge base of, and then making reasoned assessments. And people can either agree or disagree, and that's fine. But I'm never going to try and take a position that I don't have evidence to back up.
And how do you gain traction in this world, though? Because like ourselves, we're in a similar sort of space. You know, how do you actually gain traction?
It's hard work. You know, I've built up the Twitter following I have by engagement, just replying to people, and you know, occasionally hitting a wave at various times. So my boosts in following came from a TV documentary I was in, the Paras Men of War. Like, I'm sure you'll be watching that one later.
I will.
It is on YouTube. And then a wave when Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, and I was asked to do media commentary. And then a wave when Israel kicked off. And I was just really lucky in terms of being able to analyse Israel, because it hit my 3 academic areas. Yeah, law degree, undergrad, masters, war studies, and then a master's in psychology. And kind of there's a perfect storm for stuff that I knew things about already that I could then take forward and use as a lens to analyse what's going on in the Middle East. And it's something people are really interested in at the moment. So I think part of the trick is just being lucky enough to catch that wave.
Yeah, I've always been a subscriber. The harder you work, the luckier you get, though. And no, it's just because it's an interesting world out there, the amount of abuse that flies around it. And there's a lot of people who suggest that people have different agendas, and you're going, hang on a minute. There's a lot of particularly ex-servicemen who I think, you know, I was very concerned about the political backdrop to some of the conflicts we've been involved in, that there wasn't a clearly defined end state, you know, and the mission creep, and that resulted in failures. But the danger is you just become an isolated voice, and the danger is how do you build that following, because without that, it's a lighthouse in the desert, bright and interesting, but no use to anybody.
Yeah, that's a really good description of me. You know, I don't think you can. I think people who agree with you will lean towards you, and then you can have an influence on them. People who fundamentally see the world in a different way to you are never going to come around to your way of thinking. And I think part of it is acceptance that you're not going to persuade everyone. Like, if someone has seen enough of this nonsense that's floating around the internet to have an emotional reaction to decide that there's a genocide in Gaza, you're not going to change their mind by going, here's the genocide treaty, let's go through it in order. Look, none of these apply. Literally none of them apply. They're not going to say that. They're not going to go, oh my God, yeah, you're right, there isn't a genocide. How could I have been so stupid? Like, nobody is ever going to do that. They're more likely to say, you're a propagandist who's taking in Israeli money, and then swear at you and then block you. Which is what happens 25,000 times a day on my social media. And that's fine. I accept that I'm not going to persuade the world here. But hopefully, what I like to think I'm doing, and it really makes me happy when people quote my tweets to answer other people. What I'm hopefully doing is giving people who kind of agree with me the ammo they need to rebut others.
Yes.
And they probably won't persuade those others either. But, you know, the more you can get that information.
And there's no worry between the sort of PTSD type link and this abuse via social media. I'd be worried. I was quite surprised at the impact I felt when people just said, brush it off, ignore it. And, you know, I think you have to have a bit of a thick skin. But even so, it every now and again messes with your mind a bit.
Yeah, I mean, PTSD comes from trauma. I know what my traumatic triggers are, and I know how to avoid them. And if I can't avoid them, I know how to manage them. Being called names has never been a traumatic experience for me. So there's no connection between that and PTSD.
Yeah, thank you.